You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics and public policy this evening because we have back as our guest State Representative Tom Morrison, Republican from Palatine. Some would say conservative Republican. Some would say in that grand tradition of Reagan, Rauner, and now Morrison, you know, the citizen politicians, people who are sort of just general people who are citizens, and they go off to, first Rauner went off to, Ronald Reagan went off to become governor of California, then president of the United States. Rauner, of course, made his mark in business all those years, and then he sort of skipped, you know, he skipped jail and went directly, so to speak. He skipped Springfield and went directly. He didn't become a state rep, state senator, congressman, any of that stuff. He just became a governor of the state of Illinois. State Rep Morrison, of course, Tom Morrison is, of course, a state rep now, but he may have grander things in mind, and he may even achieve them. So keep that in mind, because we're talking the big picture. You know, previously on Public Affairs, if you saw that first show, you would know that, well, we dealt with the kinder, gentler side of things. In short, we dealt with how do you deal with these horrendous, really, spending cuts for very important programs like autism and developmentally disabled kids and adults. Nobody wants to cut those things. Maybe we want to make them more efficient if they're not, so more money gets directly to the recipients. Rauner made some of those cuts that drew a big stink on Good Friday. Morrison, in the last show, State Rep Tom Morrison, explained why that might have been necessary and how we could have prepared better than we had, and how in the long run, those groups that benefit from those human service programs will be better off from these cuts, as he pointed out, what he would call a boondoggle, like this mid-speed or mid-high speed rapid transit that he doesn't think will ever be self-sufficient, will always be requiring subsidies and aren't really justified by the benefits relative to the costs. If you don't throw away hundreds of millions, well, more money for the kids who are really needy, for the adults who are really needy, and that's sort of, you know, the summary of that. And then we dealt with how the fiscal 2015, the current year we're in, fiscal 2015 budget was fixed by the General Assembly and the governor. They compromised, okay? If you saw that first show, you know all about it. If you didn't, go to youtube.com/publicaffairs.tv and you can catch up. You can catch up on other prior shows that you might have missed on Public Affairs for the last 4 years, all archived there. So where does that take us? As we start the show, you'll see we're just sort of finishing with pensions. And I was trying to tell Tom at the end of the last show, I was arguing, you know, it's fine to talk about pension reform, but it doesn't really help you with the fiscal 2016 budget, which actually starts at the end of June of this year and goes through the end of June of next year. So, you know, that's got to get resolved in, you know, at least the next 10 weeks, maybe the next 6 weeks. If they want to keep on schedule, the General Assembly, they're supposed to adjourn at the end of May. You know, we're taping the show with Tom on April 7th. Well, that gives you like 7 weeks. You can't talk long-term stuff, and that's what I was telling Tom. I said, Tom, I was trying to press him, but I was wrong, and he was right. As you'll see, I didn't quite get it until I watched the show or watched, you know, I've had the benefit of seeing that tape and doing this intro. And, you know, he's talking about workman's comp, and he's trying to make the point that, of course, if you work for the state and you injure yourself, you make that claim against the state of Illinois. But if you work for a city or a village and you injure yourself in work, you make a workman's comp claim. If we can restructure and make workman's comp more efficient, more appropriate, to help the people who really are justified in getting it and not those who aren't, we might save money for the cities and villages, you know, and maybe we save $200 million. And that means the state can cut its income assistance to the cities and villages. So Tom was right. It might help you for fiscal 2016 if you can do workman's comp reform. And he's right if you can do prevailing wage reform, you know, if you can allow non-unions have a right to compete with unions, companies, and prevailing wage essentially knocks out non-union shops in competition. fewer bidders, higher prices. Governments, like anybody else, well, governments, city and local, have prevailing wage legislation, which doesn't allow them, in many cases, to deal with non-union shops. They pay more. If they can save $200 million there on prevailing wage reform, again, the state can cut out some of its assistance to villages, so that's another $200 million that's saved. And if, as we talked in the last show, if you can, through charters, school vouchers, other forms in education, K through 12 education, that allow more competition, school choice, you can actually improve quality and you can lower costs. You might save $1 billion or so. Just remember the big drivers for state spending, if you want to save money: pensions, education, and Medicaid. They each count for almost a quarter of the budget. And you can't make inroads on that budget, certainly long term, unless you make savings reforms in those three areas. So you save $1 billion in education. Say you're able to come up with some way, even though it's more of a long-term reform, in the short run, in the next 6 to 8 weeks. Say the state Supreme Court rules some of the pension reform that passed last year is constitutional. Maybe you save $400 million, not the $2.2 billion that Governor Rauner's counting on, but maybe, yeah, maybe $400 million. Medicaid, maybe $400 million if you can get additional reform. Education, $1 billion, or up to 1.8. Maybe you can get Rauner to extend the sales tax. He already seems to want to. He said during the campaign. To services, maybe you could pass that in the General Assembly, and Rauner would sign that. It's another $700 million. I think we're now up to about 2.5. To fix the 2016 budget, you need $3 to $3.5 billion of either revenue increases or spending cuts or borrowing. So we got 2.5 of the 3.5. You know, across the board spending cuts. If you cut across the board when you're down to spending GRF, which we'd be in 2016 of about $32 billion, well, if you cut across the board about 3% of that, you're going to save about $1 billion. You're done. It's all fixed. All you need to do is, how do you pass that through the legislature? Well, you get what's called, as Tom said, you'll see this at the end of the show, the grand bargain. I would have said log rolling, as we called it, but both sides make compromises. The Republicans accept, you know, some revenue increases, maybe even tax rate increases. The two are different. If they can get the kind of reforms they want in education, in Medicaid, in workman's comp, in tort reform, prevailing wage, etc. And the Democrats might say, okay, if they can get some additional revenue, some maybe even some tax rate increases, maybe closing of loopholes, they might then swallow these reforms that Republicans want and Democrats don't. In education, in Medicaid, in workman's comp, in, you know, in prevailing wage, some of these across-the-board cuts, you get a grand bargain. You get a compromise. Voila, it's done. So the important thing for you to remember is you had 2 really good shows with State Representative Tom Morrison. Come back next week and every week to Public Affairs. What is it you and Rauner want to do to amend the Constitution? What essentially will you do on the pension side?
I'm saying that the amending the Constitution may have to happen regardless of whether Senate Bill 1 is constitutional or not.
Okay. And what is it that your amendment would allow the state legislature to do?
To move forward on other pension reform proposals.
To modify the pension benefits that had not previously been earned. Is that what it does?
Right, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So going forward,
but your initial question was, what would Rauner say? So pension reform has to still be part of the
But even if it
conversation.
happens, that even if you guys could amend the Constitution, the quickest that would be is in 2016.
It would be a while, but remember
so
these.
But this budget right now.
Right, I'm getting to that.
Get to it.
So he would
We're running
include
out of
pension
time.
reform for as one piece of that. He would also say, you know, local governments, local units of government, school districts, municipalities, counties, anybody, park districts, any of these units of government that get money back from the state, if we can relieve some of the budgetary pressures they have at the local level, then they will better be able to adjust to reductions in.
Which have already
sharing.
started. The state started,
Like,
telling cities like Chicago, you're gonna get less in the future.
right,
Already, in fact, you got less this year.
right. So what are some of the
This
ways,
fiscal year, you get less.
we talked at the beginning of the show about what does a business do when it has to turn around?
Okay, so you're telling the
Um,
cities they have to start cutting back. and
Yeah,
they-
but we
And they will
also-
feel the cuts by the state government less. Is that, am I getting that
Well,
right?
for example, when we're talking about workers' compensation costs,
Yeah.
that's a huge cost to doing business if you're a for-profit business. It's also a cost of running a government. You know, if personnel makes up 80% of your budget for your municipality, you're paying a very high amount in workers' compensation costs, or I should say the taxpayers are paying that.
So you're saying village, municipal taxpayers pay for some of the workman's comp that the state pays as well?
Correct, yeah.
So when an employee makes a claim for workman's comp
Mhm.
and an employee gets a benefit, some of that comes from the state, but some comes from the city employee, city government, as well as the village government, wherever.
Well, it's directly coming out of the municipal budget, but I'm just saying that if we were to reduce workers' compensation costs, that would free up money
I see.
for the municipality or the school district. Another issue would be the prevailing wage requirements. You know, we as taxpayers, anytime there's a public project that is put out for bid, only those contractors that are, meet certain criteria can bid on those projects. Well, if you reduce the number of bidders, you're gonna drive up the cost of that project, and that's something that taxpayers ultimately have to pay for.
Yeah, in other words, there are usually union contractors who charge higher rates than
Correct.
non-union contractors. Prevailing wage is another way, is the euphemism for saying, do you charge union rates? If you
Correct.
do, you're not charging the prevailing rate, and you don't get to bid,
Correct.
right?
Mhm.
You would
Yeah.
change that.
That's part
Rounder
of the
would change that.
turnaround project, yes, exactly.
No, but you
So-
still, what we're not getting to next year, Rauner has to find for 2016 some way to deal with about a $3.5 billion hole. The other things long-term might be, I don't think they help so much. If we do workman's comp reform right now, if you
Mhm.
passed it today, April 7th, 2015, I don't think it's going to have a major dent to you in this $3.5 billion hole for the state.
Every little bit would help.
Okay.
Every little bit would help.
But let's get to
Other
let's get to the
unfunded
bigger
mandates,
things,
you know,
we're
this-
gonna run out of time.
Yeah,
Where's
sure.
the big money, okay? That's what I'm saying.
Well, the big money ultimately is making Illinois a magnet for private investment once again. I mean, Illinois has a great geographic location. We have a diversified
But still,
economy.
that takes time.
It does take time.
If you wanna
And-
get the budget actually set in June of 2015 for the next year, lay it out right now, the big drivers. Look, the big drivers you said are pensions, probably can't do a lot to reduce next year's pension costs, I don't think. Come back to that if you think that. Medicaid, some would say we've already had substantial reform. Or you could tell me we could maybe cut Medicaid even more and not hurt people terribly and just have reforms. Could we cut Medicaid? Because Medicaid's probably about 22-23%, almost a quarter of the GRF budget too. The three big drivers of this,
Medicaid, pensions, and K through 12
education.
education.
So you just
right.
said pensions can't get much for you in the next year.
Well, his budget people are saying that if we were to put these reforms in place, that it could save roughly $2 billion.
Yeah, but
That's-
everybody has said they would be challenged, those reforms. They would be tied up in court. It's unlikely he's really going to see that. Say I'm right that that can't really do much for 2016, but that leaves you then with Medicaid and education. Can you get substantial savings in Medicaid?
And you can if you continue to look at who is qualifying for Medicaid.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that the legislature forced Quinn to do was to hire an outside firm to look at who is actually receiving these benefits. As that contractor was looking through and finding people who had passed away, people who weren't even residents of Illinois, et cetera. I believe it was AFSCME basically sued to stop this contractor.
And they did. They got
Yeah.
the courts to put the kibosh.
Right, right.
If you could somehow
So-
reopen that, somehow overrule that court ruling, which is difficult.
Yeah.
If you could somehow do that, then you might save what in terms of Medicaid? efficiencies without hurting the people who are here in Illinois, who deserve it, who are entitled to it, and so forth.
Yeah,
You're saying there are people who are, for one reason or another, not by law, you think, eligible for that assistance,
yeah.
and they're getting it. So you go back, somehow you reduce those roles to be more appropriate. How much do you save roughly?
I don't have that
Ballpark?
answer.
500 million? A billion?
I don't have a number for you.
Okay. But again, it's unlikely you can do that. I'm not saying don't try. Okay, so Medicaid probably not, pensions probably not. Now we're down to education.
Mhm. Which he has vowed to increase, or at least to not
So
cut.
step back into your role of Tom Morrison. What would you advise the governor to do to maybe save money on education and also improve quality? Is there anything you could do?
Well, I'm a huge school choice advocate, as I mean, that would be one thing
What
that
does
we
that
could
mean,
do.
school choice?
Well, I think that more competition in the K through 12 arena, just like you see competition in higher ed.
How do you get more competition?
Well, with a voucher system would be one way.
Tell people what you mean by voucher.
Well, I think it's reasonable, if we're all taxpayers, I think it's reasonable to give individuals, parents, students, more authority to spend their own tax dollars how they would want, rather than based on
Sure.
the zip code where they happen to live, or the neighborhood where they happen to live.
Much of your district is Palatine. Is it all Palatine?
I got Palatine, Rolling Meadows, Hoffman Estates,
That's pretty much it.
Inverness, a little bit of Barrington, a little bit of Arlington Heights.
So if you were to say to all those people in your district, currently the spending on average for K through 12 education is what, 20,000 per kid per year? 15,000?
Not quite that much. It probably
17,000,
16,
17,000.
yeah.
It's an average. High school spent probably a little more.
High school would be closer to 20.
20,
Yeah.
grade school maybe closer to 14. So it's an average when we say
Right,
17.
yeah.
So on average, if you said to these folks, you can have on average $17,000 to spend at the school of your choice. If you're happy, you stay in your public school. The people in Palatine, in Rolling Meadows, and Arlington Heights, let's just say you could pass a voucher program just for your district. I know you wouldn't and couldn't, but say you could. Just to give people an idea what we're talking about
Yeah,
in terms
the
of
dollar
choice.
figures would actually be significantly lower. So we're talking $4,000 to $5,000 in a voucher. Where
You mean the voucher would only be for 4,000 or 5,000?
Yeah.
Well, but if you're spending 17,000, then they couldn't go out and then, what you're saying is some of the money comes from the state to Palatine.
Right.
Some
The majority comes from property taxes.
property taxes.
Right.
Okay. Well, I'm getting bogged down in the details and I'm trying to avoid it. Just say we're talking about, say everybody's happy in Palatine, okay? Which probably they often are. Okay.
I know, I talked to a lot of parents that want that choice.
But say,
Yeah.
say they'd like,
yeah,
say they would
they'd
like to, you could work it out so they could have all 17,000 on average. They could have the money that comes from the feds, they could have the money that comes from the state, they could have the money that comes from their property taxes, which is the county. The detail, folks, we'll work it out another
Yeah,
day, okay?
yeah.
That's what you mean by choice. If they want to stay in the public school, they keep the 17,000 there and nothing changes. But if they want to go to the private school of their choice, well, then they can. And I think what you might say is, you don't have to give them 17,000, Jeff, because due to competition, if you give them 13,000, there will be schools that will evolve.
I see what you mean,
That
yeah.
would be even better than they have now, but because of competition, they can provide it for 13,000.
For K
You
through,
with me?
Yeah, I'm with you. So for a
So
lot of
it's- yeah,
for
so
the
go
K
ahead.
through 8 private schools in our area, tuition varies from 45, maybe $4,000 up to maybe 6 to there's a couple of
Okay.
fairly.
But there's a variety of things about those. Sometimes it's a parochial school, they may have lower costs for labor, they may
Right.
get, subsidies, funding, whatever.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying, to keep it simple here, we conceivably could reduce the cost substantially for the state of Illinois
Mhm.
without reducing quality through the benefits of competition.
Yes, that's right.
But even
And
if we
actually
could do that, even if
enhance quality.
you could deal with all the political problems of voucherizing the state, and say we could somehow, at best, you might save $1 billion. I mean, of the amount you're spending, the state spending education. You're still left with a $2.5 billion hole. So Rounder's talked about extending the sales tax to services. And people would say, if he could do that, you might get $700 million more for the state. Would you buy into that, State Rep Tom Morrison?
Yeah, I could see that.
Okay.
That
So we
seems
got
like
$1 billion
fair
from,
number,
in our,
but-
in our dream world here, we got $1 billion from voucherizing education in the state. We've now got $700 million in revenue. That's about halfway there. Where do you get the rest? Because we said $3.5 billion hole. You and I have been working diligently on this for the last 20 minutes.
Solving the state's
We've
problems
got half.
right here.
Where do we go for the other half?
Well, as I said at the outset, I mean, the real solution long-term is making
No,
Illinois a
Tom, you
magnet.
can't dodge this. It's a,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna let you do that. I thank you so much for coming, but everybody knows, once you sit yourself in that chair, you can't go going back to long-term. You are a state rep. You gotta solve something in the next 3 months. Actually, technically,
Less than
by
that,
the end of
6.
May, if you
Mhm.
wanna stick to your regular term, you guys are supposed to have solved it and been out of there by the end of May.
31st.
You can go into overtime, but say we give you a month or two of overtime, you gotta get it done in the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
Where do you find that $1.5 billion? Tell me. You can't say in 2 years you'll find it. Where do you find it right now? We got the $1 billion from education, even that was a fantasy. We got the $700 million from the sales tax being extended to services. Where do you get the other $1.7 billion? $1.7 billion.
Yeah, no doubt, these are challenging times.
So we don't have an
So-
answer, so we've got to tell
We don't have an answer here, not yet.
And we don't even know what Rauner would say.
No, I mean, he did put out a budget on time back on February 18th.
Okay.
That would balance the budget based on 32.5 billion.
Well,
And then since that time, we have been having a robust discussion on what that means, various constituent groups, how that would affect them. But this is
Well,
not
it's not easy.
no, it isn't.
If it were easy, they wouldn't have to send you down there, a bright, smart, hardworking guy. You could send some, what do we call him? Some mope. You ain't no mope, right?
All right, I appreciate that.
Rauner's
Jeff.
not a mope. And really, to be kind, Speaker Mike Madigan's not a mope. Senate President John Cullerton, when we're not being impartial, and I'm somewhat kidding Speaker Mike Madigan, Senate President Cullerton, just giving you guys a tough time. I respect all of these folks. But all I'm saying is none of you guys are mopes. It's a tough problem, whether you're a leader or you're just a state senator, state rep.
Well,
These are tough things, right?
I will say this, that the way the state
Or
has
the
been
governor,
run-
or Governor Rauner, all of
Yeah,
you are
well-
highly competent, highly skilled, and I respect you all. And as Tom and I have been doing here now for half an hour, it's hard to solve it.
Well, the way that the state has been run for at least the last 12
Yeah,
years
okay.
has put us into a very,
But
very
you gotta
difficult
do that. You
bind.
can't keep saying those things like, we'll see how the election came out with Mayor Rahm Emanuel. We're taping this on election day. But he was saying he had tough problems for the last 4 years because he said you can't undo what happened in the prior 40 years, which is interesting because implicitly he was criticizing the 22 years of Mayor Richard M. Daley,
Yeah.
even the last 5 years of Mayor Richard J. Daley. He never used those names.
Mhm.
But you guys are sort of criticizing both Democrats and Republicans who've got us here to this problem, right?
Yep.
Okay. So education, pensions, you get some in education by having more competition. Pensions probably comes later. Maybe
Well, again,
maybe
I
Rauner
don't
can
see
figure.
those proposals moving forward in the immediate
Right.
future, but
So the only thing we really come up with here is the $700 million, and even that's going to be tough.
I mean,
because
the tax on
service
services.
tax, because a
Yeah.
lot of that hits accounting firms, and that hits accounting firms,
Well-
it hits law firms. And as Rauner says in his editorial, or in his talking points, or the talking points of the Chicago Tribune of April 7th, the real tough thing he's realized even more than he says he realized before is government is like controlled by these insiders at the expense of taxpayers and voters. Just one more time to say that. Rauner's realized more than he had before that, and the Tribune says this on April 7th, quotes him, has him in his own words, the insiders that control government, the lobbyists, the people who represent people who benefit from government, those are the insiders. The bureaucrats who are part of government, who get higher salaries than they might otherwise get in the private, if they were in the private sector, higher salaries than they would otherwise get if they were in the private sector. and then there are the taxpayers, and then there are the voters. And I'm saying we need more balance. Right now, it's tilting toward the insiders. We need to go more to the voters and the taxpayers. But that having all been said, I don't know, and right now, for 2015, he was saying no revenue increases. I think Governor Rauner has even said for 2016, no revenue increases, even though he talked about during the campaign a possible extension of the sales tax to cover services. But what I was going to say is even if he does that, and even if he's willing to make that tough vote or tough position of increasing taxes, the law firms, the major law firms in the Chicago area who are powerful, contribute to both Democrats and Republicans, will say, why are you putting a tax on us? The major accounting firms who are powerful will say, why are you putting a tax on us? And they will come to you, Tom Morrison, and they say, here's a campaign contribution, and by the way, they won't say it as a quid pro quo, could you think about this tax you want to put on law firms and accounting firms, because we think that will not be good for the Illinois economy. They will come to you, Tom. They will come to Senate President John Cullerton. They will go to Senate Republican leader Christine Radogno. They will go to Republican House leader Jim Durkin. They will go to Speaker Mike Madigan, and they will go to Bruce Rauner. All of you folks. And they will make the argument for not doing that extension of the sales tax to services. And what do you say, Tom Morrison?
I don't think that we solve our fiscal problems solely based on revenue. I think, so when you said that Rauner said no tax increase for 16, I think, to be more clear, I think he said we wouldn't even consider that unless we put these other reforms in place.
And then once
So we're not just going to cut, and we're not just going to rely on increased revenue or a new category of taxes.
So when you do that, you do the compromise, then he will allow some tax increases if he sees workman's comp reform, if he sees tort reform, if he sees education reform, Medicaid reform, he'll be okay. So, but he's not doing that until he sees these other reforms. And he's talked about there will be tough votes for Republicans and Democrats, so you may have to, and some of your friends who don't want to increase tax rates may have to swallow that if you can get some reforms.
Right.
And the folks who don't like those reforms might have to swallow that if they can
They
get some
call
of the
it,
tax
right.
rate increases.
A grand bargain is what one person described that as.
Or as
So,
we used to learn in civics, log rolling, right? Isn't that what they call
log rolling?
it? Log rolling. You
Yeah.
never heard that expression? I don't know what it means, but okay. Grand bargain, compromise.
Right.
Compromise can't be a dirty word.
Mhm.
And with that, folks, we very much want to thank State Representative Tom Morrison. Thank you so much for coming here, Tom.
All right, you're welcome.
I know there are things we didn't get to. I hope you had a chance to express your point of view. We did quite a bit. We covered a lot of ground.
Yep.
And we hope you'll come back.
All right, thank you.
But more importantly, folks, much as how it's very important that Tom enjoyed the show, got his view out, and come back, and that you enjoyed learning about it from Tom. But the most important thing, you, the viewer, that you will come back next week and every week to Public Affairs. All right, so how we do? Did you get a chance to talk?
Yeah.